And just before giving the floor to Mario, this will be a dialogue between Mario and John. Mario Fantini is the editor of, he's a journalist, magnificent writer. He's the editor of the European Conservative, which is a great publication that you can get online. You can subscribe and get the new issues as they appear. And Mario does a fantastic job on that. And also, it's very interesting. I mean, he has a Latin American background, but he's from the US. He lives here, so he has like the bi-oceanic view, let's say. And he's finishing his PhD thesis on the ideas, on the philosophical underpinnings, let's say, of the ideas of Trump and Steve Bannon. So he's perfect for the job, let's say. And well, and the other gentleman who is definitely perfect for the job is John Fan. John used to write for a long time for the Wall Street Journal. Now he collaborates very often with Fox News. He's author of several books. He has toured Europe many times with the Free Market Roadshow, and before that, of course, at least, we've been traveling Europe many times in many different cities. Chisinau, I believe, is John's favorite. But nonetheless, he's a great speaker, and I think it's a great opportunity to pick his brain and know what's going on in the US. So, without further ado, the floor is yours, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
I think in the interest, thank you, Federico and Rick, in the interest of fairness, we will have a conversation, as Federico said, and then we will open the floor to questions, because I'm sure most, if not all of you, are itching to ask him some questions. But let's start.
By the way, I do apologize for not speaking in German. Meine Kenntnis auf Deutsch ist begrenzt. Ich kann sprechen und lesen nur ein bisschen. But if you want to mix German in your questions, if you do English with something, I can probably figure it out, and Mario will help me with it.
I will try. Okay, John, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Welcome again.
The Hayek Institute is one of my favorite groups.
And you're one of our favorite speakers, I can say that, without any hyperbole. Many observers, many analysts said that this midterm election was the most important in American history. That is hyperbole. That is an exaggeration, or is it not? How do you assess the importance of this past election?
Well, in the United States, we have tried for many years to increase voter turnout. Because whereas you might have 80% of Austrians vote in a national election, in America it's probably 60%. For the midterm elections, traditionally it's 50% or less. So we've always had these debates. What does it take to increase turnout? And the answer is now obvious. Donald Trump. Donald Trump will increase voter turnout. A bunch of people who like him will vote who normally don't. That's how we got elected in 2016. A bunch of people who don't like him, especially after he beat them in 2018, are out for revanche. And our turnout went up. Interestingly enough, by the way, this was the first election in my living memory where there was no discussion that there was too much money in politics. Because billionaires like Michael Bloomberg, Tom Steyer, yes, George Soros, and others spent so much money to defeat or to humiliate Trump in the midterm elections. For some reason, there was no complaint about them spending all this money. I found it just an interesting observation that for once there was not too much money in politics.
I'm glad you raised that. It was one of my later questions, but let's jump right into that. I had received a question from a German friend, and she wanted me to ask you, why is money so important in elections in the United States? Because here in Europe, she was saying, it's the polls that really matter. How do you explain the importance of electoral money and PACs in America to a European?
Traditions come from deeply rooted sentiments or laws in a given country, often. The tradition and the sentiment in Austria and most European countries is that the candidates should present themselves to the voters, the parties should present themselves to the voters, and television advertisements, especially using demographics, suppressed, and money should not be the important thing that people should consider in politics. Parties should have equal access to public broadcasting. That should be enough. The newspapers, some newspapers lean one way, some newspapers lean the next. There's a rough balance. So it's a different tradition. But these are mostly backed up by laws. There are laws against contributing over a certain amount of money to a candidate in European countries. There is no tradition of an independent person like my mind is escaping me. The Austrian millionaire from Canada who came as front of the political party. Stronach. His daughter failed to bid for Canada's leader, so he decided to go back to Austria. He was caught by the political bug. Well, he had to launch Team Stronach. He would not have been able to spend large sums of money to support another candidate, I don't believe. He had to do it for his own party, for his own name. Look, I'm not here to argue that one system is better. I'm here to remind people, though, that we have a Constitution that includes the First Amendment. And the First Amendment talks about some fundamental rights, including freedom of speech. And our tradition is that political speech is the highest form of speech and must be protected and encouraged, and there must be the fewest limits on it. Therefore, what you would call hate speech, we would call hate speech, but it's not speech you're going to make illegal. Or stupid speech, maybe, not illegal. So we don't have, the Supreme Court has ruled political speech is free speech. Therefore, you can't place any limits on it. And here's my interesting question. And I asked this of John McCain. He frankly didn't have an answer, even though he was a big supporter of these campaign finance limits. The reason why people spend so much money in politics is because the government is so big. It's so powerful, it can dictate economic outcomes. In Austria, if you had a company under the report system and you didn't fit in, you could be punished or rewarded in the past, depending on whether or not you were in favor with the government. Not all companies, and not very small companies, but many companies. If you were a landlord, you were often subject to the whims of rent control. There are all kinds of powers the government had. People, if they can, will spend money to influence that. Sometimes it takes the form of bribery. You have the Bauer scandal, right? It'll take the form of bribery. If you want less money in politics is the symptom of a larger problem called power in politics. If you have too much power in government, if the spoils are so great, people will spend money to get to it. So the 5-letter word people always talk about is money, but money is the symptom of another 5-letter word, which is called power.
That's a great response, very provocative. It generates a lot more questions, but I want to put those aside because I want to get back to the election and its supposed historic importance. I say supposed because there's an ongoing debate. But let me ask you this very simply. Was this midterm election a referendum on Trump?
Sure.
Very simple.
Yeah, both sides wanted it to be.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, so who are the winners and who are the losers? Both sides.
It was mixed. I think clearly Trump's weakness with suburban women voters was really made clear. They weren't the only people who turned against him, but they were the people who most turned against him. I think largely because of his style and his bombast and his bullying, which rubs a lot of people the wrong way. So Republicans lost a lot of seats in suburbs, especially suburbs where highly educated suburban women revolted against him. He's changed the image of the Republican Party, which is positive for some people and negative for other people. Trump also went into some of these red states, the Republican states that had voted for him but still had Democratic senators. And in places like Indiana and North Dakota and Missouri, he was able to oust Democratic senators basically on his personality, popularity there. Those states he was more popular. So the answer is it's mixed, but there was more negative against Trump in the election results than positive for Trump. He, of course, will never say that because, like Pangloss, he lives in the best of all possible worlds.
Well, I thought it was hugely, or I could say hugely significant that the Washington Post said that Trump had won this election. I never thought I'd read that in the Washington Post. They admitted that the Democrats did very well in the House, but then they said, net, Trump won. Did you see that? And how do you...
I would go a little, that would be a little too far. I think the people in the White House I talked to were disappointed. They didn't think it would be 35 seats, they thought it would be closer to 25. But the underlying Republican strength in governorships, state legislatures, these are the bodies that draw the district lines. We do not have a parliamentary system, as you know. We have elect people from individual districts, and though that underlying strength, which will lead to the next maps of who is put where in terms of districts, that still remains. The Republican Party dodged a bullet this time, but the bullet came very close.
Yeah, it grazed the cheek.
Yes.
Now, there were some interesting candidates, some unusual ones, all sorts of different alternative lifestyles were represented in the scene. But I want to talk about the return of the establishment Republican, of the moderate Republican, of the Rockefeller Republicans, because I think those more moderate type of GOP candidates did well in some states. Are we seeing a return, or is this just some analysts maybe overblowing or overstating the case?
You may be right in individual cases, but overall, I think moderate Republicans are still a dying species, because many of the suburban seats I mentioned to you, these are seats that Hillary Clinton won, but still elected Republican congressmen. And because of that dynamic, they were often more moderate than the rest of the Republican caucus in the House. Many of them lost. So I think, what is it the famous communist slogan was? After one of the Stalin's purges, one of the Stalin's henchmen said, "Oh, not to worry. We may have fewer communists now, but they are better communists." I think some of the Trump people say, well, we may have fewer Republicans now, but they're more slavishly loyal to Trump than the old bunch was.
Now, did anything surprise you about the results?
Of course, sure.
Well, what were your predictions initially, and then how many of them came true?
I predicted 25 seats, and I was wrong. It was about 35. I predicted 4 Senate-seat gain. It's probably going to end up at 3, maybe possibly even 2, depending on how things go. I predicted Democrats would gain about 5 or 6 governors. They gained 7. So the Democrats did a little bit better than my predictions. But you're right about the influence of polling. Everyone was polled so often this time. And if you took an average of all of the polls, they basically were accurate. There's a safety in numbers in polling, because every poll has a margin of error. So you never want to look at one individual poll, because the variation between what one candidate gets in the lower end of the scale versus the upper end of the scale is so dramatic. It can be 6 or 7 points. But if you take all of the polls, thousands and thousands of people selected for their demographic characteristics, the polls were right this time. And the Democrats did about as well as people expected. There were individual surprises, but not that many.
I thought for sure we would get meaning the GOP would get both the House and Senate. But basically a day before the election, from my own Facebook feed, which is populated with Democratic friends of mine, I could see
the result.
I could tell what direction this was going to go.
Well, we have so much early voting by mail in America. You can often tell the trend lines by who sends in their ballot early, because you may not know exactly how they voted individually, but you can see if they're a registered Democrat or a registered Republican.
Now, let's focus on a few specific races. Let's start with California, where the GOP did really badly, if I remember correctly. No surprise there. California has been drifting further and further left for
The
years.
extent of the disaster is surprising. There's a difference between a catastrophe and a disaster. This was a catastrophe.
Are we ever going to get California back, you think?
Who's we, people say. I've spent many things, I've had many changes in my political views. I've had many different hats. I've never been a registered Republican. I'm just not a party person.
Are you an independent? And
I don't even vote for president. I haven't voted for president since Ronald Reagan. And it's not because I'm against voting, it's just that because I cover the presidency, I just don't want to have to add that extra layer of emotional attachment to someone who sits in the White House. So I do vote, don't get me wrong, I just don't vote for president. The last president I voted for was Ronald Reagan, and I thought I was going to leave on a high note after that. So as for voting, a lot of people when I go on television, which I do frequently, if someone in the White House has done something really, really stupid, you have no idea how relieved it is if in response I say, well, I didn't vote for the guy, and actually be truthful about it. And I enjoy that actually.
Gives you an out.
It's just something I feel better about. I mean, I'm really glad I'm really glad, despite my anger at George H.W. Bush, I'm really glad I didn't contemplate voting for Bill Clinton. I'm certainly glad I didn't vote for Barack Obama, even though it was tempting because John McCain was not my type of candidate. And I'm still glad I didn't vote for Donald Trump, but I'm even gladder that Hillary Clinton didn't win.
Yeah, me too, I can say that. Now, about 12 hours ago, I read that they're still trying to figure out what's happening in Florida with the Senate race, and they're going to a hand count.
And the governor's race as well, I think, maybe.
Is that incredible? Or I mean,
No,
if
a race is close enough, you have an automatic recount, which is a good thing. But we have two counties in Florida, Broward, which is Fort Lauderdale. That's where spring break is for college students. And then there's Palm Beach County, which is where the famous Palm Beach is, but most of the county is middle class voters. Those two counties are run by election board of supervisors, incumbents. I mean, you can't tell where their incompetence ends and their possible involvement in fraud begins. It's that bad, and it's been that way for 20 years. I think the new governor should probably fire them and raise the building and start over.
Now,
but the cheating is real in the sense that there's two kinds of vote cheating. There's the kind where you actually steal votes, you alter or have votes created that are not valid. But there's also the kind of cheating whereby if in a recount you don't give proper access to the media to observe the recount, you do things behind closed doors, you mysteriously discover ballots that were not counted previously over and over again. I call that sort of practiced incompetence or practiced interference with the media. And that kind of cheating is not outright fraud, but it leads to legitimate and understandable suspicion about the results.
Another good friend of the Institute and good friend of yours, Henry Olson, yesterday, I believe, wrote an interesting article that seemed to suggest that Trump is to blame for the GOP losses. I don't know if you caught that article.
I caught probably an early version.
Yeah.
Yes.
But what I found more interesting than that supposed blame that he placed on the administration or the president was his analysis that college-educated people, college-educated independents in this last election are the ones that really turn things around by going to the Democrats. So during the presidential election, they seem to have voted for the Republicans, but this time around, that particular voting class went for the Democrats. What do you think of that analysis?
Well, some of it is entirely understandable. Look, if you went to college, and you're probably in professional capacity now, doctor, lawyer, Indian-chief, psychologist, manager at a company, Donald Trump is not your style. Let's just say, if a Donald Trump worked in your company, I think human resources would be called. So he's a hard pill to swallow. And a lot of people, especially women, because he sort of is an exaggerated alpha male version of a bully, a lot of people, especially women, recoil against his anti-intellectualism. I mean, I have written books for other people at times. We call this ghostwriting. In fact, there's a great movie by Roman Polanski, which I recommend to you, called The Ghost. It's a story of a ghostwriter for a former British Prime Minister. It's a great movie. And ghostwriters are supposed to help with people who don't have the time to write the book themselves, or they wrestle with English language and lose. And in the case of Donald Trump, both may be true. So I was asked to consider ghostwriting a book for Donald Trump, and I learned a couple of things in research, I learned that he has a different ghostwriter for every book, which is not a positive trend, because well, there's some turmoil there because it's a good gig. So presumably, if it all went well, this person would go on to the next one. So I learned that there was a different ghostwriter for every book, and so I finally got to meet one of them. And he was, he said, I was perfect. I was perfectly happy with the book, and I think it's a good book and all that. And I said, so it was a good experience. And he says, yeah, but it was a strange experience. He says, look, I've done 30 of these. And I've done them for all kinds of people, sports people, opera divas, and I've done it for difficult egos. And he said, but this book is different. I said, what? Will you blow up? And he says, no, it's just, I had a tape recorder, and I went and I interviewed him, then I adapted the tapes to a book format. And I said, okay, so how'd that go? He says, well, I'm not sure. I've done a lot of books for people who couldn't write books. But I tell you, I'm convinced that this is the first book I ever wrote for someone who didn't read my book. In other words, he says every time Trump would go on a television show to discuss the book, there would be questions, because the host had read the book, or parts of it, and Trump would never answer anything about what was in the book, and the hosts that he talked to were convinced that he had never read the book.
We're talking about literature. I have to show all of you, and you this just arrived this morning. It's the beautiful poetry of Donald Trump. They've taken his speeches and chopped up different phrases and reassembled them by theme. It's hilarious. I have to say. I thought you'd enjoy seeing that.
I, Donald Trump, do solemnly swear I will faithfully execute the office of President. I promise I will never be in a bicycle race. I will not rename the White House. I promise not to talk about your massive plastic surgery that didn't work. I promise, thank you. It's all hypothetical. Slowly the hair dries. It's a process that could take 18 months to 2 years.
What's sad is, it almost sounds like one of his speeches.
All this is...
Yeah, but they're chopped up.
Yeah.
All right, I think there was a question in the back.
Maybe this is the moment. What was the influence of the caravan of immigrants from Central America on the elections on the one side, on the other side, the healthcare issue?
You're well informed. I think that's an excellent question. The healthcare issue was important because the Democrats chose not to have a positive agenda. They consciously chose not to say, if we get elected, we will do X, Y, and Z. Instead, they said, if you dislike Trump, vote. You should dislike Trump, especially because if he keeps his majorities in Congress, he will end the part of the Obamacare health care bill which said that if you have a pre-existing condition, if you have an already determined heart problem or cancer problem, it may become more difficult for you to get at a certain price. And they argued that Trump would take rid of that. And that worked for some voters. That's what the exit polls showed. The caravan, even though it was thousands of miles away at the time of the election, I mean, the leading elements are arriving now. And I don't think it had a major impact, less than health care, but most Americans have seen pictures of the 2015 refugee crisis in Europe. And I know that at the Austrian border, you had a real issue because, of course, people were streaming over from Hungary. And I think for border states that played some role, and also the general sense that if the government doesn't have control of the borders, it doesn't have full control of the safety issue. And so while this issue can be exaggerated and over-dramatized, it's clear that there were people in Central American countries, politicians, who had a political agenda in sending this caravan north. They did not spontaneously decide to go travel together. That's not the tradition. Somebody helped organize them, and I think it was to embarrass the countries that they were coming from. How can you possibly claim to run this country when your citizens are fleeing? So I think the underreported part of that story was not American, it was Central American, which is who encouraged or who helped assemble these people and sent them north from those countries.
I'm sure there's some interesting theories floating out there as to who that. I've heard the name Soros,
Of
of course,
you know,
but he's the bogeyman for everybody.
you know, for the Democrats, it's the Koch brothers, Charles and David Koch, and for the right, it's Soros.
Yeah.
And my view is, and I actually know the Koch brothers, and one of them told me, you know, if ever I want to feel good in the morning about how much power I have, all I have to do is go and read the newspapers and describe all the power I have that I don't really have. And I mean, it's just amazing what people think I can accomplish.
Boost to the self-esteem.
Yes.
So the second part of this question is interesting too. The healthcare that has kind of receded into the background, hasn't it? Or
Well, there's no doubt that a Democratic House of Representatives is not going to repeal Obamacare. So even though it's inefficient and I think clunky and complicated, and I think it's led to some unintended consequences, it will be trimmed around the edges through regulation and management changes the Trump people make. But it's remaining in place for at least 2 years for sure.
for the record, my own.
Although there's another court challenge to it that actually could have some chance of success, because the original Supreme Court decision upholding Obamacare said the only reason we're upholding it is because it is a mandated tax, equivalent to a mandated tax, because by requiring that people have health insurance, making it mandatory, that's a form of taxation. Well, what Trump did do in his tax bill was he got rid of that mandate. So you no longer absolutely have to have health insurance in America. If that's the case, a literal reading of the law would say, well, without that tax, the Supreme Court's decision upholding Obamacare doesn't stand. I don't think that will be repealed completely, but there could be some significant retreat on Obamacare if the court takes that case and rules on it.
So what kind of a time will the administration have for the next 2 years? A hellish time? Or will they be able to get some things done?
Well, if you aren't issued a subpoena, you know, it'll be all right, but hundreds of people will be issued subpoenas to deliver documents. Congress's oversight roles will become something resembling the Grand Inquisitor. Trump's accomplishments, like the tax bill and other things, are safe, but his ability to go beyond them is limited by how imaginative he wants his executive orders to be.
Right. Let me ask you a question I've asked my own father. Can you support the Trump agenda, the Trump administration, without being a Trumpist, without being a fan of Trump?
Well, I work for a magazine, National Review. We published an issue, a cover story, in January 2016 that said "Never Trump," and it had 25 leading conservatives, including Ed Meese, Ronald Reagan's Attorney General, and many others, who said Donald Trump is not a genuine conservative. He has no track record that we can be confident in, and we don't support him and don't want him. Well, some people have eaten his words. Some people have actually served in his administration. Most people who've worked with Donald Trump will tell you he's a difficult boss, and he's a bully, and not particularly likable in many respects. He can be very charming when he wants something from you, but that's not his default option. So as a result, I think that I've always said that in politics, you should pay attention to policy and principles rather than personalities. And never was that more true of Donald Trump. If you like something he's doing, wait 5 minutes, he'll do something you don't like. If you don't like something he's doing, wait 5 minutes and he'll surprise you, sometimes in a positive way.
He's a man in search of an agenda or in search of principles. I'm not even sure he's searching for principles.
Well, no, there's to Trumpism, there are some unifying themes. He doesn't always follow them. I mean, he has both children and adults attention deficit disorder. He both can't pay attention and needs attention at the same time. So I think the America First foreign policy, which is so controversial in Europe, has roots in American traditions, and it's genuine. I think he really does believe it. I think he believes that his trade antics actually did convince the Canadians and Mexicans to come to the table and renew a form of NAFTA. I certainly support many of the policies Trump supports, but I've known the man for 30 years, And I have difficulty with his personality. Yeah.
Back to the audience, any questions out there? Anybody have, Federico?
Thank you, thank you. John, what do you think about, you mentioned that there could be a ruling on Obamacare, and that reminded me of this gentleman, Brett Kavanaugh, and all what happened. Do you think that happened, had an impact on the election? And the other thing is, what do you think about the whole thing in general? Because it was like a scandal, some people thought that it was weaponizing the Me Too movement, you know, politically and all these things.
I think the Kavanaugh disaster further reduced the ethical and moral standing of the United States Senate. I think it did hurt the Democrats because they led that ethical and moral decline. And I think some Republicans turned out to vote that wouldn't otherwise have voted because they were so mad at how Kavanaugh was treated. As for Kavanaugh's accusers, there were primarily 3 of them. 2 of them have been completely discredited. The other one, Dr. Ford, the more we hear about it, the less we know. It's interesting, after Kavanaugh was confirmed, the House Democrats and the Senate Democrats initially said, well, we're going to make sure we investigate this and get to the bottom of it. For the last month, I don't think I've heard a peep from them. So if they're preparing to investigate and take a look at it, I don't see it. I think they see it partially as an embarrassment. I mean, one Democratic senator admitted to me, this is for show. My people back home expect it, but I don't really mean it. My heart isn't in it. But the political pressure of my party is so great, I'm going to have to go vote for it.
So, are we never going to see a return, never meaning the next 2 years, a return to cordial relations between the Democrats and Republicans, or are these divisive, acrimonious debates and fights going to continue? I mean, it's terrible among my friends, among family members. When are we going to see a return to whatever it is that was normal in American public civic life?
Well, Mario, it wasn't as normal as we remember because, it's like sort of like the golden age of television. It really wasn't that golden and was more of a unicorn.
And it looks so in retrospect, right?
Yeah, well, a unicorn is a wonderful thing. And we all would like to have one or see one, but it's just not going to happen. It's a unicorn. So I think civility in politics is sort of like that. We remember that it was more civil, and it was to some extent. But part of that reason that it was more civil is both parties had sort of a Me Too agreement going. The Democrats wanted to dramatically expand government, the Republicans wanted to do it more efficiently for half the cost. And if you have something like that, it's easy to be cordial because you're basically, the bills write themselves, they're compromises. One side gets, 55% of the deal, and the other side gets 45%. And I don't like the current environment, but I will tell you, if you want more citizen activation and participation in government, have elections like the last one. A lot more people voted, a lot more people crossed the line, a lot more people paid attention and studied the issues because the election was exciting.
It reminds me, it was about a month before the election that Trump, at some event, declared himself to be a nationalist, and that got quite a bit of play in the media in the United States, and a lot of Europeans noticed it too because of the rising nationalist populist movements over here. What was your reaction when you heard him say that? I think he said, I'm not afraid to say it, a nationalist.
Well, nationalism has a unfortunate nomenclature, both in Europe and partly in the United States. But if you look it up in the dictionary, it's a perfectly acceptable word, meaning, in political terms, you believe your country should be taken care of first. The policies of your government should primarily be to promote the interests of your country, not someone else. And if people want extraordinary missions or use of equipment or anything like that, where both government and private sector can rent it out, depending, because I think you get a broader point of view. In general, the military does a pretty good job of informing its troops. They really do.
Back to the audience, any other questions out there? Anything you're itching to ask, John? Yes?
You were talking before about moderate Republicans and Republicans who are more loyal to Trump. So Trump has obviously changed the Republican Party. Do you think there's still a place for people like Bill Kristol and John Goldberg, because Trump's base kind of says they are not real conservatives?
Oh. Could you rephrase that just a little bit and to make it a little bit more refined as to what you're looking for? It's a much broader topic.
Okay, so Trump's base is kind of a bit aggressive against people like Bill Kristol or Elliot Abrams, John Goldberg, and they refer to them as not real conservatives.
Well,
so,
okay, I now you've broadened it to include more people I can discuss. I did not just want to discuss Jonah as a colleague and all of that. Well, Jonah, I think, is a very acerbic writer, and he and Trump have gone after each other long before Trump became president. But Jonah supports Trump's policies, but he agrees with them. It's the whole style and the whole cult of Trumpism, you know, sort of the cultish, slavish followers that he sometimes attracts. Bill Kristol, I mean, I know Bill, and I think that there's a certain amount of bitterness there. That, you know, Bill was at the age where he thought he could serve in one final Republican administration, and that's not going to happen. I mean, I think Donald Trump would have to get to the bottom of the phone book before he discovered Bill Kristol's name. True never-Trumpism is largely an intellectual, media conservative phenomenon. Because if you're a writer, you know, it's easy to say, I don't want to support anything or have anything to do with him. And I can understand that, but most people live in the real world, and they have to, you know, what is it the famous general said? You go to war with the army you have rather than the army you want to have. Well, similarly, you have to work with the government you have rather than the government you want to have. And that's certainly the case in Austria with the shifting coalition governments over the years. Trump's personality is so overpowering, people tend to forget what's really important, which is how policy is changing. And there's some areas like trade where, of course, I have concerns about what Trump is doing. But on taxes, I think his tax cuts have fueled the American economic recovery. And I think he'll have more things to do, like an executive order indexing capital gains to inflation, which would turbocharge the turnover of assets, because you would pay capital gains tax only on the real gains that you had in the asset rather than the artificial gains of inflation being topped on top of it. I don't think there are that many never-Trumpers, and I think that there are fewer slavish followers of Trump, because it's hard to defend him on everything. I mean, I haven't found a Trump supporter yet who thinks that every tweet is appropriate or valuable or helps him. I mean, sometimes he is his own worst enemy.
Speaking of tweets, do they matter at all? I keep making the argument to friends that those tweets are just a distraction. It's just entertainment, and what's the real work's getting done behind the scenes.
Well, yeah, but remember, the tweets are there for two purposes: to anger the media, pick a fight with the media, and they take the bait.
Always.
I mean, Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, Watergate fame, journalist. He said, "Why do you take the bait? I mean, Trump wants to have a war with you, but, you know, it's like two pigs wrestling. You know, neither one is going to come out clean." And Trump is not that popular. He's about 45%. But in terms of credibility, the media is at that or below. I mean, it's not as if the media is viewed favorably by many Americans as being a paragon of objective truth and accurate analysis. So it's always dangerous to do that. So the tweets are there to annoy and continue the war with the media, which I think is a mistake, but that's why he's doing it. And secondly, he has 25 million followers. Now, Mario, if you felt the media were treating you unfairly, and you had a device that would allow you to communicate short messages or link to articles written by others and reach 25 million people, you'd probably be tempted to take advantage of it.
Are you hitting the button all the time?
Well, no. And of course the media does report on the tweets. So I disagree with the tone of the tweets and the insults and the language, but I can't disagree that I can't argue that there's not real communication value there for the White House. There is.
But it's a campaign tactic. I mean, he's continuing to use the same tactic he used in the presidential campaign.
Well, we have the permanent campaign in America now. You know, you in Austria, luckily, you know, your political campaigns show up about every 4 years at 4-year levels. They last, what, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and then they're over, except for the arguing about who's in the coalition government. In America, we have a new industry that's sprung up in the last generation or two. We have pollsters, we have campaign managers, we have spin doctors, we have dirty trick artists, we have all kinds of characters. Some of them become famous, like Roger Stone and Dick Morris, and etc. And they wanted full-time employment. So I think part of the reason why American politics, the campaigns never end, is because you have an entire army of people who make a living off of this. So we now have a permanent campaign. And I'm a victim of this too. I mean, there's a lot of things I like to write about that have nothing to do with politics, but I always have something to write about now. Always.
Any other questions out there? Anything you'd like to ask, John? Yes.
I would like to refer to Trump versus the Federal Reserve. They're in a permanent conflict, or have been in a permanent conflict, even ahead of these elections 2016. Are you expecting this conflict keeping up, and if so, what would be the consequences for the global economy?
You know, that's a very, very well-informed question, but I think it needs some context in the answer. People got very upset that Donald Trump criticized Fed Chairman Powell, whom he appointed to the job, because Powell wants to raise interest rates, which have been artificially low, limited by the central banks, and also European Central Bank has been artificially low. And because after 10 years after the Great Recession, it was time to get back to normal. And the intervention of the Federal Reserve and other central banks has been very unusual and not healthy for a competitive market economy. So presidents don't like that because higher interest rates means the federal government has to spend more on debt service. And it also means that voters get higher prices they don't want to pay. And so presidents and the Federal Reserve always have a natural tension between them. But this argument about Powell is a little misplaced given the historical context. Presidents, ever since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, have always had fights with the Federal Reserve. They just haven't been public. Because there's assumed to be a distance, a hands-off attitude that the Federal Reserve is independent. Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. Richard Nixon appointed Arthur Burns, who was then the ambassador of the United States to Germany. He appointed him to head the Federal Reserve in, I think, 1971. Later that year, Nixon imposed wage and price controls on America, which were very, very dramatic intervention. And he told Arthur Burns at the time, you will keep interest rates down until after the 1972 election. And Arthur Burns did do that. We only learned about that years later. But that was something far more dramatic than anything I think we're likely to ever see between Trump and Powell. Powell relishes his independence, and the last thing he would want to do is to be seen as publicly knuckling under to President Trump. On the other hand, there are advantages to President Trump attacking Powell because he can always say, well, it's not my fault. I mean, I gave America a great economy, but the Fed messed it up by raising interest rates. And by the way, this happens in both parties. The Federal Reserve under Ronald Reagan, we now have, this just came out in a week or so ago, James Baker visited the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, and told him, don't raise interest rates. And Volcker said, sorry, I make my own decisions here. And Baker went away. And Volcker says, he said he was speaking on behalf of the President of the United States, but who will ever know? And I suspect Ronald Reagan didn't demand that Paul Volcker raise interest rates. I think it was more like Henry IV. Oh, who will rid me of this troublesome priest? Then the priest is gone. So Reagan probably was moaning about higher interest rates in the Federal Reserve, and somebody said, well, I'll go do something about it, you know, see if I can do my boss's bidding. This is an old story. I think that the only difference is it's now public. The president attacks the Federal Reserve chairman.
Yeah.
Before, it used to be done behind the curtain.
Yeah, now all the dirty laundry's out in the open. But it takes some nerve, some courage to go up to Paul Volcker and ask him to do anything.
Well, notice Ronald Reagan did not do it personally, and I still believe Ronald Reagan did not know if the Baker had done that.
Other questions out there?
Excuse me, and the consequences, you don't expect any consequences for the global economy because the Fed will raise up the rates?
Well, your question, unless I misunderstood it, was about the attacks that Trump had made on Powell.
Yeah.
Well, I've just explained, I thought I did, that tension between the Federal Reserve and the president is normal. It's not more public, but it's just as ignored in general.
Okay.
So Powell actually, by being attacked publicly, is much less likely now than ever, and it was never a good chance, that he will ever change his policy. He's going to have his own policy, which is gradual 0.25% increases in the Fed funds rate. So how can it have consequences for the global economy if Powell ignores him?
Okay.
So there will be no consequences because Powell now can't obey Trump unless he wants to destroy his entire credibility, and he won't do that.
Okay. Did you have a question? No. One observation I made during this administration is, and I'm relieved to recognize this, is that the whole Hollywood connection seems to have disappeared. Remember with the Clintons and with Obama, there were Hollywood stars right and left, always.
Well, they still are. The markets were full of them. Barbara Streisand gave a concert to defeat Trump and elect Democrats. No, Hollywood has been very, very much involved.
With Democrats, but not with Republicans at all, right?
Well, there are not that many Trump celebrities. Caitlyn Jenner has abandoned him. And Kanye West is not ambivalent.
What Tom Selleck?
Well, he's semi-retired. Look, I know the Trump Republicans in Hollywood, or I know of them.
You can count them on one hand.
No, they're more than that, but they're not going to reveal that publicly.
No.
I mean, you commit suicide only once in life.
Other questions out there? How are we on time? Who's the taskmaster here?
We get a quarter of an hour.
Okay, great.
I feel that there's a general discontent worldwide with politicians, by politicians appearing to have control, but not making it explicit how they have control over politics and over the countries. So there's a sort of soft, benevolent diffusion of statements from politicians, and the biggest concern is what does it mean in reality? Whereas Trump seems to say, these are my ideas, and I'm going to do it, and that makes him a hero in comparison to other politicians. Isn't Trump more principled in many ways than most politicians?
Because he does what he says? What do you think of that?
He does what he says often.
Until he doesn't.
Until he doesn't.
Yeah, okay. Nothing is better.
Look, I mean, a Trump supporter would point to all the promises he has made that he has kept, and these are real. A Trump opponent would say, well, he's spoken on 500 things, and on many of them he's contradicted himself, he's changed his mind, he's pretended to do one thing while doing something else. I mean, for never having been a politician, Trump has been a pretty good one. I mean, he has all the characteristics of the beast. But the larger point that you made worldwide is this. Look, all of our countries have a politics that is dominated by elites of some kind. And even though we are free countries, certain groups of people have exercised disproportionate power. And there's a consensus that develops, where the elites, even if they may be on the right or on the left, they also have interests in common. And in Austria, I'm not an expert in Austrian politics, but I understand enough of the purport system. There was an unholy conspiracy that certain elites would share power and share the spoils of power and divide them up and ignore the interests of many average people as a result. And I think it was more pronounced in Austria actually than in most countries. So that's started to fall apart or break apart over time because nothing stays the same forever. And the internal contradictions of any system like that catch up with it. Well, that's happened all over the world. And look, I'm a member of the elite. I aspire to be one. I want to be one. I hang out with them. And, you know, I don't spend a lot of time in the beer hall or the bowling alley. But I have been there, and when I do talk to people, I think many of their concerns are very legitimate, which is there are forgotten Americans and there are forgotten Austrians. And the democracy or republic can only work if it brings everybody up as much as possible at the same time, that you don't leave people behind. Globalization has created winners and losers. And I certainly support free markets, and I certainly support the work of the Hayek Institute, but we cannot ignore the fact that in pursuing globalization, things like immigrant labor has lowered the wage rates of native people in both America and Austria. And we can have policy arguments about that, but we should recognize that it did happen and does happen. And that, you know, some people may be xenophobic, but it's not necessarily xenophobic to worry that your schools are getting more crowded because of people who have come from other countries suddenly, and there's suddenly 15 languages spoken in your children's school rather than one. So the elites often dismiss all of the arguments against what they're doing as either being xenophobic or racist or uninformed or stupid. Some of them are, but not all of them, and many of them are very, very important. Look at what Angela Merkel did in Germany in 2015. I know enough about Germany. I lived there for a while as a child, and I have many German relatives, that what she did was just astonishing. Because the Dublin Protocols say, and you know, they all worship at the feet of the EU dictates and the rules. You have to follow the EU rules. Well, you follow the EU rules until you don't want to. And that's what bothers me about the elites. If you set yourself up as an elite, you have a higher responsibility. You have accountability that you don't have if you don't aspire to that kind of position. You're supposed to follow the rules more than other people. You're supposed to be honest more than other people. You're supposed to be less hypocritical than other people. And they often aren't. I mean, the Maastricht Accords, you cannot increase spending beyond a certain point debt. Well, except when the French want to do it, except when the Germans want to do it. And you're not supposed to lend money to people who, you're not supposed to give European Union membership to people who shouldn't have it. Well, except for the Greeks. And even though we know they cut their books, well, we need to give them membership. I mean, I hate it when elites don't act like elites. Okay? They have a responsibility to act like elites. And in Austria and Germany and places like that, they don't. Angela Merkel had a responsibility under the Dublin Protocols. They say, you process the refugees, the migrants, or the asylum seekers in the first country of the EU, you don't send them on. Well, she sent 1 million people on. And that was wrong, and it was stupid, and she paid the political price. She was going to end her chancellorship in partial I think, partial disgrace as a result of it. And you can't defend that. And I mean, I was at a meeting of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in New York the other day, and we had senior people from the CSU and the CDU there. And they both said, we can't say this publicly, but you know, she's practically destroyed our party. So the discontent that you have expressed is real. I don't necessarily believe the average voter has the answer, and I certainly believe that you want expertise and you want people who know how to do things running governments, but they must be held to the highest standard. And when they're not, you have public discontent like you've seen in Austria. The election results from the last election happened for a reason. It's because people lost all faith in the existing system. And they just said, enough, we don't believe them anymore. So they voted for different types of candidates. On the one hand, we had one party that threw out its leadership. On the other hand, you had another party that had one of its best results ever. And they formed a coalition government.
And this is exactly what happened in Brazil, too.
Oh, Brazil is perhaps the most dramatic. I mean, this is a fellow who'd been a very undistinguished career, Bolsonaro, in Congress for 30 years in the Brazilian legislature. No great accomplishments. Was, spoken Trumpese, which is, a gaffe a minute, or at least a politically correct statement every minute. And, I mean, he won. He beat everybody. And they call him Trump of the tropics.
Do you have any more questions?
Yes. After what you said, but I'll go to my original question. Now that it's been 2 years since Trump won, more or less.
2 years.
Yeah. And there was this midterm election. Two-part question. First, do you think he'll go for re-election, and what chances does he have after these results? And the second thing, and maybe for the two of you, now that 2 years have passed and things have come down, why do you think he won?
Well, she said we only had a quarter of an hour. There's a 70% chance Trump runs for re-election. I think he wants to, but there's always a small part of him, I think, that might want to. The one thing he hates to do is lose. And even though he says he's always winning, and he's going to win for you until you're sick of winning, until you're tired of winning, there's a chance he doesn't run for re-election. He's also will be 74 years old, and he is slowing down now. You can tell. But I think he probably will run for re-election. He has a base of 45%. The Democratic Party has moved way to the left, to the extent that they have presidential candidates calling for the abolition of the Border Patrol and Medicare for All, which is a fantasy proposal. Against a very left-wing Democrat, Trump can win. I'd say the odds of Trump being re-elected are 50-50. As for why did he win in 2016? Because Britt has been so generous with time, I'm going to keep the answer very, very short, so I'm going to oversimplify. About 20% of the voters in 2016, people who actually voted, not just answered polling questions, about 20% of the actual voters told pollsters, we hate both candidates. Not just dislike, hate them, which is a very strong word in politics. In other words, they thought Hillary Clinton was either Lady Macbeth or at least a little shifty, and they thought Donald Trump was at best P.T. Barnum running a circus, and at worst, a fascist, and they had to choose because they did vote, and 60% of them voted for the devil they didn't know or the devil they knew. And I call the choice that the American people faced in 2016 the evil of two lessers, which, if you know English, is a play on the phrase the lesser of two evils. And that's ultimately what you want. Now, there's a whole layer of complexity below that regarding the forgotten Americans regarding the fact that Hillary Clinton ran one of the worst campaigns I've ever seen. I mean, her slogan was "Stronger Together." I think "Make America Great Again" beats that. Hillary Clinton was not an actual candidate. You could walk through her deepest confidence and not get your ankles wet as a candidate. I mean, the use of the word deplorable. You accuse, remember, in politics you attack your opponent. You do not attack the opponent's voters. It's like a company attacking the customers of the competition. No, you don't do that. You attack the competitor and convince them to buy your product. You don't attack the customers. She did that. She deserved to lose. And believe me, to lose to Donald Trump is a major accomplishment. You have to work at that. Thank you. I really appreciate your coming out. How many of you were here for my last talk here with Henry Olson? Anyone? Oh, we have some new people. Good, good. Well, thanks for coming, and happy to sit here and chat and answer or talk to you individually if you'd like. And I want to thank the Hayek Institute and Mario for your hospitality, and good luck with the European Conservative.
Thank you.